Okay, so it's actually been quite a while since the last video. I can't remember since the last time I worked on those on camera. I've just been practicing on these quite a bit since then, just getting a better feel for the muscle memory, getting a better feel for like what to do when it warps, getting it closer to finishing. So I basically found that there's no one magical simple solution that's gonna solve everything, which in a way kind of simplifies it but makes it really tricky. I can actually get the rough geometry pretty close to where I want it, and I'm pretty happy with that. That's a big accomplishment since last time because I was struggling with getting that rough geometry. Now it's, you know, the last 5% trying to dial it in, trying to get the ura, that backside grind, like super tight and crisp along the edges, and trying to get everything just dead nuts flat. And I'm close, but finishing it is really, really difficult. I've basically figured out warp using those two different approaches that I talked about in the last video, using the Shim temper for the big warps, and then using that Carbide chisel to dial in little sections here and there. The ura is still a very big challenge, and that's where I'm kind of stuck at. I'm using a larger wheel now since the last video. It's helping me get the geometry that I want, you know, getting the tighter ura towards the edges and then the flat bottom in the middle. I'm pretty confident with that so far. It's just getting that to like the final finishing stages where I start to wash out the lines and kind of take a step backwards. So ultimately, I'm not gonna be able to get a perfect Yanagiba right away. It's just gonna be an ongoing process, getting better with each iteration. Same thing with any of my other knives. It's just iterating one after another. These are the 4 that I'm working on right now. They all have their sort of wonky problems. This one, I burned the edge of the heel, but overall it's pretty good. This one, pretty good, but it's got a slight warp on the backside. This one is very warped. You could probably just see it right there. This is the one I'll be working on. And then here's my own personal one. I burned the temper, whatever. And also the handle is fucked up, so that's gotta come off. So I'll be working on this one, the one with the giant warp, because it's the earliest in the stages. I'll take out that big warp, I'll start doing the hollow grind, and then I'll start finishing it out and show you everything along the process and all the troubles that I run into. I try to predict like where it's gonna warp because I've noticed knives tend to warp towards where they're being ground. So I try to account for that and get it to warp straight towards that grind. Except, well, if you look at it right now, it is not straight. And the warp is bad enough where that little Carbide chisel hammer is not gonna correct all of that. What I'm gonna do right now is the shim and temper method. So it starts right around here and then ends at the very tip. I just mark it right there and look at where basically the cusp of the warp is, and it's right there. I put a little shim right under where that line is. Make sure that when you do this, you've already tempered it once, because if you don't and you start clamping it, it's just gonna snap right in half. So how far do I clamp this? Well, when I look at the warp and see how much is bent, I'm basically going to bend it in the opposite direction, about the same amount. And since it's such a big warp, I'm gonna go pretty far. We might need to do this more than once. Okay, so whatever I said last time, ignore it, because the warp ended up being so bad that by like the 3rd or 4th time I was doing the shimming and tempering, it was still pretty warped. So it was facing a little bit, but not as much as I needed it to. So if it's that bad, probably should just re-quench the blade, which is what I'm doing here. So I'm gonna do a interrupted quench, meaning I'm gonna take it out, I'm gonna quench it until it just gets right under the perlite nose. So that's just gonna be a few seconds. I'm gonna listen to hear the bubbling stop, and I'm gonna feel for the vibrations to stop. So that's what I'm doing. Then I'll take it out, put it in between these aluminum quench plates, and hopefully that'll keep everything straight once it's all cooled down and transformed into martensite. Quenching now. Okay, no more. And that should be good. So once this is cooled down to room temp, I'm going to clean it off, make sure that it's straight, or at least straight enough where I can do my mild warp corrections, and make sure that it's actually hard, because I don't want to do all this work and then find out that it's soft. So hopefully that'll be it for the major warps, and then from now on we can just grind and do little corrections from there. Okay, so blade's been heat treated. I ground off the decarb, made sure there's no soft spots in there or anything like that. It's pretty straight, not perfect, but that's okay, because when I grind it and when I finish it, it's gonna need more correction down the road anyways. I'm gonna start doing the hollow grind now. I'm gonna do the middle section first, and then I'm gonna start doing towards the edge and towards the spine. I think that's gonna be easier for me just to get depth first in the middle, and then when I get towards like the edge and towards the spine, it's gonna be easier for me to see and kind of dial that in. I'm using a much bigger wheel now. Last time I was using a 5-inch wheel, it was just way too small, and I wasn't getting any control. I couldn't really blend the geometry well at all. This is gonna be a lot better. It's a little bit soft, but I just gotta be careful when I get towards like the tip and the curvy areas, because if I apply too much pressure, it's gonna wanna conform and wash out those nice transitions that I work so hard for. So I'm gonna start the rough hollow grind using a 36 grit belt just to get the depth. And then when I start doing the spine and towards the edge, I'm gonna switch to an 80 grit belt just so I can see better, have more control. So once I get the rough grind and I get the depth and the radius kind of where I want it, I'm gonna check the warp, check if there's anything else going on, and then start creeping up and going finer and finer in the belts. One new thing that I've got going on is I've got light on my forehead, which is gonna really help me see what I'm doing. It's gonna make it a lot easier. Okay, blade's been rough ground. I did a little bit of straightening using the shim and temper method. There is a little bit of a significant warp right here, but that got rid of most of that. So now it's time for fine tuning using the updated new important other tool, the Carbide chisel hammer. This is the same one, just, you know, ergonomically revised. So now I'm just gonna look, sight down, see where the problem spots are, mark them out. So there's a little spot right here. And I look both directions, up and down, back and forth. There are just some things you don't see looking one way or another. There's another one right there. It's the same idea as before. You're just looking for the areas that are more concave and you're hitting into those concave sections. Essentially just stretching the metal out at that part and then pushing everything away. It's the opposite of what you'd normally do, straightening with like a mallet or a hammer or something, but you can't do that on fully hard steel, so this is where we're at. So I'm not hitting it hard, I'm just doing, you know, kind of like hitting with like a drumstick or something. Just kind of bouncing it off the steel, making sure that it gets good contact on the anvil. And these corrections only go so deep into the steel. Because we're planishing this very surface, if I grind too far into those marks that I just made, I essentially erase all that work that I just did. This isn't going to be some final solution where like the warp is finished and then I never touch it again. Like there's always going to be more corrections going down the road. The idea is you are just tapping it, getting it straight, and then you take off just enough material so that you don't see those marks anymore, but no, not really any further. And I have to put a disclaimer, I accept no responsibility for any failures to anyone who tries out this technique. You're taking a really hard object and you're hitting it with a much harder object. Oops, wrong direction. I think that's good enough for now. Next, I'm going to actually start doing the Uraoshi sharpening, which is sharpening on that flat hollow ground side. Then I can see where the low and the high spots on here that I need to touch up and then start basically taking everything down to its final geometry. And then, of course, doing more of this, correcting the warp as I go along because it's going to keep shifting as I take off more and more material. Okay, so I went back and forth between the diamond plate and the grinder and just basically took off all the high spots and then made sure that all the low spots were raised enough so they can get pretty much an even perimeter all around. Slight low spot here. This is the low spot that I was trying to get, tapping it with that carbide hammer to kind of bend it in place. Just tiny bit. It's almost there. That's good enough for me to go forward. So basically, I'm just looking to be able to hit all this perimeter around with a flat stone. I think that's good enough to go forward with finishing it. It might not be dead nuts flat yet, but we'll get there. This is kind of like the starting place for me. And so now, since this is, you can kind of see like the three sections of the grind. It's pretty close to where I want. I'm gonna hit it on the grinder again, just really quick, get these rough scratches out, and then we'll see what we can do as far as hand finishing. Okay, and now it's at 600 grit off the grinder. I did a little bit of like diagonal blending in the middle, but you can still see it's got those three sections. This area is really tricky because that's where like both the ends converge to the middle, but pretty happy with it so far. I was able to get it tight along the edges and get a nice rounded transition right here. And overall, it feels pretty smooth. I don't feel any irregularities or anything like that, even though it looks uneven as hell. The depth is where I want it, and the radius kind of flows up to the edges really nicely. It's been a lot of work practicing to get to this point to be able to do this on the grinder, but I'm really happy with it so far. So I think it's ready to be finished. I would guess this would be good to go to just hand sand with sandpaper and stuff like that, but I'm actually gonna try something new that I haven't done before. Okay, so this is, I don't even know what it's called. It holds a stone, it's powered by air, and I've never ever used this thing. My friend Will Brigham gave me this, and it sat here for an entire year while I was practicing on these. So I'm just gonna try a little bit and see how it works. Should be off. So that's off. Jesus, that's not off. I don't know. The fuck? It just goes, even though it's not on. Well, it's time to leave.
Yeah, see you later, dummy.
I probably should have tested this setup at least just a little bit before I try to film it, but since the last time, I got a pedal setup for this. I got a pressure regulator, and I shortened the stone just a little bit to make it all easier. The difficulty with doing just sandpaper is my hands are not that precise, so every time I sand back and forth, it's gonna wash out that transition just a little bit. So this, hopefully, will help me be able to get it to a nicer finish without washing out those transitions. We'll see how it works. This is actually kind of cool. So, get some water on here. This thing's a little uncontrollable. So I have a pressure regulator on it. The speed control on here doesn't work. It just seems to do whatever it wants to do. And I'm trying to regulate the speed and the frequency with my foot a little bit, but it's kind of tricky. So far, it's much better than before. So this does kind of what I expected to do, and all. So this does kind of what I expected to do, which is take out most of the scratches, but it It's not perfect. There's a lot of those little waves still in there, which I think is honestly kind of okay, as long as I have the overall geometry. This is actually helping me do really well because I can just run it right up to the edge and I'm not going over the edge. It's a little bit finicky with the speed. Like sometimes it kind of has a mind of its own. Like, works good. Yeah, I don't know. My main concern was just hand sanding and keeping everything clean, which I think we're good to go on that front now. Oh, fuck, that was 320. This is so awkward. I made some changes to the way I was doing the sanding. Before I was trying a bunch of different sticks and I just had a hodgepodge of different sanding sticks that I was using. Like this one has some sort of radius and I was trying to just hold sandpaper and sand in line with the blade. Wasn't really working, didn't get control, and it was a pain in the ass to hold. I tried making some sticks where I had the radius this way and I was holding it in the same way that I hold my other sticks. But the problem is when you get sandpaper and you try to conform it to a radius object and then like fold it and hold it, you get this weird bulbous part that just doesn't sit on that radius tightly. So that'll definitely wash out all your hard work and it just doesn't work well. So I was like, well, is there any way that we can make a sanding stick that can hold it at the radius and you can just like flip through and change the sandpaper to a fresh piece every single time? The very first thing Sam told me out with was using smaller width for the sandpaper. It helps conform much better and it's just more efficient. So when I was looking at the sandpaper and seeing if I could somehow make a stick that held it at the radius and was able to fold and change paper really easily, I was holding it at a radius, and then when you fold it up like that and you fold it back here, this is kind of like the shape you end up with. You get this like radius at the bottom and then these two like tighter radius areas where it wants to naturally sit. And so that's what I did here. It's got the big radius at the bottom and then it's got a radius at the back and a radius in the front. So that way I can actually take some sandpaper, wrap it around, hold it tight, and it stays true and sits flush to that bottom radius. And this is a game changer when I'm trying to hand sand this. Do I really need that fancy stone holding pneumatic thingamabobber? I don't think so. It helps a lot, especially in the more difficult areas. But I think if you were able to grind your geometry really, really tight and accurately and get it out to a nice high grit, sanding it with something like this would get you, I think, where you need to be. You could take a normal radius object and just glue your sandpaper to it, but then that's not very efficient because anytime the paper wears out and loads up, you've got to take it off and put a new piece on there, and it's just too much work, too much time. And now the Ura is pretty much done. It's exactly where I want it. I did the Ura Oshi sharpening and I still was able to maintain that consistency across the perimeter. You can see that it's still tight along the edge, along the spine. I would call that a success. So now that the backside is pretty much done, that was the hardest part. And so now I could just kind of go forward. Assuming everything stays straight still, I can finish this out and finally get this thing done.